Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, Amy, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest, Dr. Amy Meyers. Amy, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Awesome. So Amy is a social work professor at Molloy University and a clinician in New York City, where she's maintained a private practice for 30 years. She's an advisory board member to the Sibling Abuse and Aggression Research Advocacy Institute at the University of New Hampshire. She's published and presented nationally about sibling abuse. Amy has also conducted numerous trainings and workshops on diversity locally and nationally, and transformed the Long Island School District's approach to culturally responsive and inclusive teaching. Dr. Meyers is also the host of the podcast titled What Would Dr. Meyers Do? And we're going to talk about that today. Amy, welcome.
Thanks.
Awesome.
I'm excited to be here. Yeah.
Cool. So before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and then where you are currently.
Originally, so I am from Long Island in New York City, and I currently remain there. I've been a New Yorker for pretty much all of my life. And I am a psychotherapist, as you introduced, and became a professor kind of as my second profession. And I'm really, really interested in focusing on countertransference.
Cool. So I'm also originally from New York. I used to live in Long Island too.
Really?
Yeah, I love talking about it and miss it, and kind of I'm envious. You stayed there for. I often fantasize about going back, but we'll talk about that later. All right. So we got your podcast with countertransference. We'll talk about, but before we get there, how the heck did you get into this field?
How the heck did I get into this field? So seems like an easy question, but I don't know how complicated it is. I'll try and make it simple. First of all, my mother was a social worker and a psychotherapist, but I always say I don't think that had much of an influence on me professionally, in the sense that she really never shared her work whatsoever. I just knew, as she kind of developed a private practice very part-time and brought it into the home, I had to be damn quiet while she saw clients. But she wasn't somebody who talked about her cases. So I just don't make that direct connection. What I make the connection to is a dysfunctional home environment where I became very curious about why people do the things they do, act the way they do, feel the way they do. And I think, I was always kind of a sensitive kid who was very empathic and felt the plight of others. So having that kind of natural intuition into other people's emotions, combined with my own struggles and challenges, I think that probably was the perfect formula for becoming a psychotherapist.
Yeah, I mean, well said, and makes me really understand what you're talking about here. I mean, on this, without getting into specifics, and you share whatever you want, but on the scale of the continuum of dysfunction, on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being, off the charts, what are we talking about?
That's very interesting. So I hate categorizations. So I appreciate your request for me to quantify my experience, but that's very, very difficult, right? Because people say everybody's, got trauma, I think, on some level. And who's to judge whose trauma is worse than others? I just know that I felt like I had a lot of hardship. So as you said in your introduction, I have become an expert on sibling abuse because I've conducted research on it. I work with clients who have experienced it. And that was my experience growing up as well. So, it was a traumatic upbringing in sorts.
Yeah. Sibling abuse is something very interesting. I don't haven't talked too much about it on here. Um, what is it? I mean, I think we hear that and we can, come up with our own definitions and ideas, but how do you define it? How do you talk about it?
So it's interesting because when I was embarking on my research and I was telling friends and colleagues that I'm doing a study on sibling abuse, they said, basically, give me a break. Isn't that a dramatization of sibling rivalry? And basically, sibling abuse is really probably defined the same as parent-child abuse, only it occurs between or amongst siblings. Um, but I think what is undermined in our society and culture is how impactful siblings are on our development. And so when one experiences this in the household, not only is one being kind of betrayed or targeted by one's most prolific peer, but also it's kind of a double whammy because the parents, just by the nature of it occurring, are neglectful, right? So it's kind of
Mm.
that double whammy of impact. And just to kind of define it. So, but by the way, on my podcast, What Would Dr. Meyers Do? There is a series on sibling abuse. So every like 5 episodes or so, I do, informational or have a survivor tell their story. So one can learn much more about that. But I just want to kind of hone in on your question so that people do have an understanding of its seriousness. Sibling rivalry is a normative aspect of development. It helps people develop the ability to negotiate, to manage conflict, to communicate, to cooperate. And usually there is an equal opportunity for advantage or disadvantage between the siblings. Like
Hmm.
within one argument, it may go back and forth with name calling or pushing or something of that level. Or if one sibling has the power, the next time there's an argument, the other sibling has the power. In sibling abuse, one child is always in the always holds the power and the advantage. And
So, excuse me.
there's
So we're not just talking about sexual abuse.
no
Okay.
emotional,
Okay.
physical,
Okay.
psychological. Um, yes, and it's sexual abuse that gets the most attention. But actually, my study was on physical and or emotional abuse. And so there's intent to harm. And that's the difference between the key element between sibling abuse and sibling rivalry, right? Like you can cause some harm or injury during rivalry, but the intention to really kind of harm your sibling is not there.
When I was reading your bio and it mentioned this that you're an advisory board member to the Sibling Abuse and Aggression Research Advocacy Institute, and I was looking over their website, which says that sibling aggression is the most common form of family violence. It remains hidden and confused with sibling rivalry. I mean, it just sounds so intense. Um, what did you learn? Perhaps maybe when you were doing your research, what surprised you that a lot of us maybe might be surprised to hear about this topic?
What surprised me? Is that what you're asking? Well, I guess it's interesting. Not a whole lot surprised me because I had my own lived experience.
Yeah, yeah.
So, if anything, it was validating, right? That other people had very similar experiences, and that it's so powerful to me that it still remains under the radar. And when I conducted the research, it was even more under the radar, more under recognized. And so that was quite shocking. And maybe the extent of the experiences that some people had that were quite different than mine at the same time, because, right, there's a range of how abuse can be imparted. So some of the stories were quite upsetting.
Like you said, it oftentimes goes unnoticed by the parents, or by default, they become neglectful. It would seem to me that it could easily just go unnoticed and come under the heading of, oh, kids are or having rivalry, or they're arguing and whatnot.
I think it's kind of interesting because these days, there's this thing called helicopter parenting, right? Where the parents are hovering and so overly involved in their children's lives to some extent. And yet on the other side, right, how could somebody be so oblivious to what's happening? I don't think that necessarily there is oblivion. I think that at times there's either physical or emotional absence of parents due to their own stressors. Sometimes the parents are abusive as well. So the child is learning from modeling that this is acceptable behavior, or it's displaced behavior. If a child is being abused by a parent, obviously they can't abuse the parent back, so they displace it onto, a more readily available target.
I want to move on to a different topic here, but before we do, and we'll direct people to your podcast to learn more about this. But for the therapists out there who are listening, how might they detect this or begin to talk about this if they're curious that this is going on?
I think that's a great question. I think we are conditioned to really kind of think about and wonder about the impact of the parent relationship to the child on that child's development, but we really don't get into the sibling relationship. And so I would just say, just as a beginning assessment, start to ask about the quality and nature of the sibling relationship growing up, because if you are treating a child, you may be the one to uncover this, right? But if you're treating a survivor who might not even have the language to call this abuse, they need your help in identifying and validating their experience because of the societal lack of recognition. So I think it's incumbent on therapists to know the questions to ask, which I also go into much more detail on that in one of my episodes. Not to sound fully self-promotional, but just I know we don't want to spend a whole time talking about this. And I think that, there's many ways that we have to learn to kind of use language to uncover it because, again, the abuse terminology isn't there. And it's like when I was conducting this study, I never said, has anyone out there been abused by a sibling? Because I don't think people would identify themselves as that. So you have to use, were you ever teased, pushed, overwhelmed by your sibling? So you got to know what questions to start to ask about how this is impacting one's self-esteem, self-perception, and interpersonal relationships.
Okay. So right out of the gate, and when you started getting into this field, was that your focus?
No, not at all. No, I majored in sociology in college because I didn't go to school with an undergraduate program in social work. I think, you just start to kind of do well with what you're interested in. And, you start to lean towards where you excel. So, I can't say like, when I was 10, I wanted to be a therapist, right? It just kind of started to come together. And I think part of, my focus on countertransference, which is about why we feel the way we do and act the way we do, receive people the way we do, respond to people the way we do, comes from our early relationships. So I think I was not only curious about others, but about myself, right? Why am I either struggling or just kind of have these responses? And I think that was the foray into, wanting to go into this field.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. So, your interest in countertransference, how did that come about, and how did that manifest in the work you were doing?
I think when I was going for my training, I learned about it in graduate school, social work school. They teach you about transference and countertransference and the projections that clients make on you and that you potentially will have towards your clients, and how important it is to be aware of that and not lead by that, but understand that and where that's coming from. And I just thought that was fascinating. And then when I went for postgraduate training in psychoanalysis, that was 50% of the equation. And I always tell my students now, if you go into this field to think that you're just helping others, you're mistaken, right? And not only just help others, because you get the privilege of helping yourself through this process as well, but also focusing on others. You have to, be okay with learning more about yourself, even though some of what you see initially might not feel very good. You got to understand it.
Right. Now, how was that for you? That invitation, almost demand for that self-exploration and self-examination. What was that like for you?
It was complicated. it was um,
Well,
it was
give me
difficult.
more, Amy. We will
Yeah,
get a little more
I'm
specific
getting in
here.
there. I'm
Yeah.
getting in there. I think, I don't know why somehow it stuck in my head that it took me at least 5 years to feel a little less anxious and slightly more comfortable with doing the work because it brought up so much stuff all the time that it's very overwhelming, right? Emotionally, psychically. So not only are we holding as therapists our clients' stuff, right? Are their emotions and their challenges, but we're managing our own at the same time. That's a lot. And that's why I always say that the work is draining. It's not because it's really kind of, as we know, a hard science and your brain is being racked with numbers or, difficult material. It's emotional. It is 100% emotional. And so now, of course, I enjoy it. And now when my countertransference comes up, it's kind of thrilling, right? Because my self-esteem is not where it was, many moons ago, and it's made the work a hell of a lot more enjoyable. But so yeah, initially it's not fun.
Give us an example, if you can, of like when you started out and the countertransference came up for you. How might you have dealt with it? What did that look
Um,
like?
well, you're asking me to tap into my memory of like 30 years ago. That's really difficult. So I'll try, but I mean, I can certainly talk about how it still comes up, right? All the time.
Yeah, let's do that
So
too.
let's assume, assuming your audience knows what countertransference
Uh, oh,
is?
you want to step aside and define it?
Yeah, let me
Or
step
yeah,
aside.
okay.
Okay, so transference again is our projections that our clients have towards us. Countertransference is the therapist projections onto the client. And what does that mean? It basically means that we've had certain experiences growing up that make us into who we are now. And we have had people respond to us in our lives that have shaped the way that we perceive ourselves and potentially perceive other people. So I like to say that we take in those experiences, we internalize them, right? And then we make them our own. So, for example, if you
Hmm.
had a really critical mother who, negated a lot of things that you said or negated your physical appearance or your intellect or whatever it might be, you take that in, right? And you say, ooh, I am how my mother perceives me. That is who I am. And then we externalize that. We move through life projecting that onto other people and expecting that they're going to respond to us in the same way. So, how that might manifest is, so many different ways interpersonally, right? With friendships, with romantic partners, feeling less than, wanting to please so that, you know, people don't, um, um, uh, sorry, I just lost my thought. If people don't kind of hurt you, if you protect yourself and know that you're already kind of a piece of shit or, don't think of yourself very highly, then hopefully I won't be as sensitized to your words because I already know that. So that's one way that it can play out. It can play out, if I'm a professor, right, in the classroom, somebody who's never going to raise their hand or share their opinions or viewpoints because they're already assuming that I am going to think that they are stupid. That was a silly question, or how can you think like
Mm,
that, right? Because I am replicating the voice that's already been constructed into their ego.
right. And right. And then you can just think about or imagine what that looks like when you're working as a therapist with a client. My God.
Right. So imagine, a client kind of disapproves of something you said and you get caught in your head about, oh, see, I shouldn't be doing this work or I'm not enough or whatever. Right. And then you're kind of off and running with that. And then you're not present for the client. Or you might overcompensate by responding in a way that you hope that they'll like you or that they'll think better of you, which isn't necessarily a therapeutic intervention for them. It's a
Hmm.
therapeutic intervention for
Hmm.
yourself. Right. So a lot of that goes on at the beginning, or at least it went on for me. And so that's the whole point of being able to decipher what's real, right? What's real in this moment with the client? What is something that I'm bringing to the situation, or what is something they're bringing to the situation? So if a client accuses me of not listening properly or not getting what they're saying, was I distracted in my own thoughts? And they're absolutely right. And I'd have to acknowledge that. Or are they projecting onto me of never feeling listened to, never feeling valued? And this is a microcosm of what goes on for them outside of the therapeutic room, right? Or did I really mess up and wasn't attuned to them? And I need to kind of bring myself back and make sure that I'm present. So it's so important to distinguish that.
Right, right. And that comes in part from a lot of self-awareness, a lot of self-exploration, doing all that quote unquote work before you get in the room. Remember, someone told me, I think it was Lisa Ferenc, who said, if you're working with a client and you find yourself thinking about your working on your own stuff in that moment, you're in the wrong room, right? You should be in your own therapeutic room. So
Right.
what's the takeaway here when you find yourself in that moment, kind of doing that work? What's the teaching moment, would you say there?
Yeah. So I think, as I said, it's about being aware of what's happening. And that's kind of a refined art that takes time. It's a lifelong process. It requires, as you said, therapy is very helpful. Supervision is very helpful. Peer supervision is very helpful. You're not going to be perfect in the room all the time. And so you have to be kind of forgiving of yourself as well. And just as long as you're reflective and you use whatever happened to improve the next encounter or the next time that your countertransference comes up, that's what's most important. So, I mean, countertransference comes from personal experience and it comes from bias, right? We all have biases, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, whether it's about race, religion, ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, et cetera, right? And so we're not perfect people. We all struggle. We all have our own challenges. It's a matter of keeping that in check and knowing, I think the more experience you have, the quicker you are to pick up on when you're having that countertransference. And if I can, I can give you an example of how that goes on still for me now.
Oh, yes.
Right? Because,
yeah.
Countertransference, I think, it's mostly unconscious. And so the goal is to make it conscious that this is occurring. Otherwise, we do just act on it and we don't, right, observe it. So it's not something to get rid of. It's something to understand and to manage. And I think that that's really, really important because we have countertransference every single day in every single interaction that we have. I believe that, right? The moment I saw you, right? Do you remind me of somebody? Something as simple as that. You have
Right.
either facial recognition that feels familiar or a mannerism, right? Or maybe the more than I talk to you, the way that you relate to me. And I just respond back. That's what most of us do. We don't realize, oh, you know what? You remind me of, this friend I used to have who used to do this thing and drive me crazy. And if I'm not aware of that, I'm just, going to be short with you, short-tempered, as opposed to saying, this is me and my stuff. And, Guy has nothing to do with this person. So what does this look like now? I could tell you about 3 or 4 clients that, touch my stuff all the time. So one example is I had a client recently who she's older than me, living with her 90-year-old mother. Her mother's living with her because that's what's happening in this generation, right? She's got to take care of her mother who's sliding into dementia. And the client is constantly trying to get her mother to understand why she has her shortcomings. So, don't do that. Stop that. Don't you remember I told you that? All the things that you're not supposed to do with somebody who has dementia, right?
Mm-hmm.
My father is cognitively declining, and I have the same impatience at times with him. And it's a terrible cycle because I go to visit him and I say, I'm going to be more patient. I'm not. I get angry at myself. I say, next time I'm going to do better. And it's the same cycle, right? So part of me empathizes with her. I get the struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of me, I find myself kind of being corrective of her because when I hear it outside of myself, it sounds so terrible how you're treating your mother. Right. So that's something I have to manage. My being, and punitive is a strong word, but coming from that is not going to be helpful to her. She already feels bad. Right. So what is that going to do? That's one example.
And that may or may not be something that you might share, right? A little bit of it, whatever.
Well, that's very interesting too. That's a whole nother discussion about self-disclosure, something that I wasn't really trained to do. And I'm seeing more where it has potential purpose.
Yeah.
I think with self-disclosure, again, we just have to know, who are we really serving? Is it
Right.
you and, don't worry, I get it, and you want to share that to show you get it? Or is it a way to validate and normalize somebody else's experience?
Let's talk about the podcast. What would Dr. Meyers do? When did you start this, and why did you start it?
So I started this over a year ago in November of 2022. And why did I start it? So it's really interesting, at least to me, because again, if we think about countertransference in my life experience, I'm not one who always felt I had a voice, right? And that I had things to say and of value. And so I never dreamed to be a podcaster. I never dreamed to be a professor, right? It all just kind of happened along the way. But I was in class with my students, and it was in a practicum course where they were also in internships at the time. And so we did a lot of processing. And so one of the students said, boy, I wish I had you in my back pocket and I could just pull you out and be like, what would Dr. Meyers do? And I even struggled with that because the title of the podcast, because I thought, who's Dr. Meyers and who cares what she would do? And it sounds so grandiose, right, in a way, but it was just catchy. I liked it after a while, and I leaned into it. So the podcast started off a lot to be about me talking with my students about what they were experiencing in the field, and it led to conversations about self-disclosure, boundaries, countertransference, and I realized that there was a niche here to be able to talk about what we experience as therapists as we move through working with others, and what comes up for us and the challenges that we have. And it allows people to kind of be that fly on the wall of like, wow, what do therapists really think, right? Because we're not these perfect people.
So you mentioned conversation with your students. Do you actually record conversation with your students?
Well, yes, but I'm not recording a conversation. I mean, we are having a conversation purposeful for the podcast.
Okay.
But I'm also, I talk with seasoned professionals.
Interesting.
As long as we're looking at, and some person has to be willing to look at their countertransference.
Yeah.
What comes up for them as we're talking about what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's such an interesting premise for a podcast. And I mean, I think it's interesting to hear you say that you struggled with thinking or feeling that you had a voice, because as I'm talking to you now, you have such a strong voice. You have, and it just feels like you have so much to share and so much to offer. And now I'm guessing your podcast on Apple, on Spotify, everywhere that podcast can be had and heard. People can access that. Yeah, definitely. We'll link that up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So, this whole thing, this whole topic is very interesting to me because of countertransference and transference, because a lot of people get into this field of psychotherapy because they want to quote unquote help, right? Which is understandable. And on the surface, it's a good reason we want to help people. But a lot of people, not everyone, of course, but a lot of people don't realize the degree to which you've got to look at yourself and be willing to wait. I want to help that person. Wait a minute, you're asking me to look at myself? Whoa, that's different. That's hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think people should certainly know that before they go into this field, and maybe that's not emphasized enough. And to me, that's along the lines of mandating anybody who goes for a bachelor in social work or a master's in social work to have therapy. You got to know what it's like to be on the other side of the couch. But we don't mandate that, but I highly recommend it.
Oh. All right, Dr. Amy. Awesome having you on here. We'll link again your podcast up. Aside from that, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
You can email me at drmeyerspod@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram if you want to IM me there. Send me an email.
Awesome.
Happy to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, look, great meeting you. Great talking to you. You're welcome back here anytime. And I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Yeah.